A focused Gervonta Davis is a dangerous one, and he's posted on social media talking about how he feels like himself again, and that's good news to hear because I always felt like Tank and, him and Lamont Roach, that was a tremendous fight, and I really enjoyed it, but I feel like Tank has more left in the tank, no pun intended, but he just didn't look like himself to me. And a lot of people are saying, like Shakur, Terrence Crawford, they all said that Tank wasn't, anything different. That was Tank himself. But I feel like that wasn't Tank. I feel like Tank has another gear that he can shift to. Like, he understands it now after fighting Lamont Roach the first time. I think he just has to step on the gas a little bit earlier and to take it up a notch, ultimately turn into that next gear, because ultimately I still think Tank, even though it was a draw, I feel like Tank only gave about 50% in that fight camp or in the fight. I just don't think that was the best version of Gervonta. And I think in a rematch, and, I understand that Lamont has power, has sneaky power, and he hurt Gervonta in the first fight. And he had a really good performance, but that's the point. It was a really close fight, even with Lamont Roach's best performance. When Tank has a better performance, what does that make it? If it's a draw when Lamont Roach has the fight of his life, maybe he even deserved that. But on, official papers, that was a draw. According to the official scorecards, Tank and Lamont Roach was a draw. And that was the best version of Lamont Roach I think we're ever going to get. If he proves me wrong and somehow drops Tank or stops him in the next fight, much respect to him. But I just don't see that happening. I think Lamont Roach hit that ceiling, his personal ceiling in the first Tank fight. And I think that in the next fight where Tank has way more improvement to make than Lamont Roach does, I feel like if he makes those adjustments, he's going to win the rematch. I really do believe that, because Tank is a dangerous fighter regardless. Everybody knows it in the back of their minds. They saw Tank, dealing with the stuff in his eyes. I'm sure he's going to be very, cautious of that now and not really deal with anything with his hair. Maybe he just buzzes all of his hair off and just focuses on getting it done. There are rumors about, Calvin Ford being the head trainer again. So if Tank figures out those little details in the corners of, him, Barry Hunter, and just seeing what happens, with going back to what works, if it's not broke, then don't fix it. You don't have to make any adjustments, because I feel like Tank was doing just fine with Calvin Ford, and I think that it could just be like information overload. Like, Tank has too many voices in his ear when he just needs, Calvin Ford, in my opinion. Like I said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And for Tank, I feel like this is going to be a really interesting version of him, because he already said it. Tank said it in his post-fight interview with, Lamont Roach after he got that decision that was a draw. Tank was saying, the fans, they were booing him, and Tank said, they hate you now, they love you later. I'll just turn it around, make them love me again. That's what Tank said. So he already knows he's going to have a better performance. He felt like that wasn't the best version of him, and he already said, it's on me. Tank took accountability for the first fight. So I think that he knows the adjustments that he's going to have to make. He has to start a little bit faster, be a little bit more aggressive in the early rounds, because like I said, that was the best version of Lamont Roach that we're going to see. I don't think that Lamont Roach is going to have a better performance than he did, in the first fight. I don't even know if he's going to be able to match that, because he fought at such a high level in the first fight and only got out of there with a draw. Now, we're talking about the knee, right? That was a big controversy. But the facts of the matter are that, they didn't count it. The referee decided to not rule it as a knockdown when Tank took that knee. And yeah, that's unfair, but ultimately I don't think Tank's going to do that again, because it was such a controversy, and he got lucky to get away with it that time. But in this time, he's not going to get away with those kinds of extracurricular activities. Tank's going to have to step up earlier in the fight, and I think if he does that, he's not going to have a problem with Lamont Roach. If he's laser focused on Lamont, I got to favor Tank. And like I said, if Lamont Roach proves me wrong and somehow drops Tank or stops him, which is highly unlikely in my opinion, much respect to Lamont. I could be wrong, but when I look at it, I look at the first fight, I think Tank makes the proper adjustments. He's going to get Lamont out of there in the rematch, and then everybody's going to be back on the Tank hype train. I'll call it now. Tank's going to beat Lamont Roach in a rematch. It's no disrespect to Lamont. I just look at it and I'm like, all right, Lamont Roach fought the fight of his life, didn't even get the win there. That's boxing politics. So I feel like with a refocused and a different and better version of Tank, who is really lasered in on what he has to do against Lamont Roach and starts fast, I feel like he's going to stop Lamont in a rematch. So we'll see what happens. Great fight regardless. But let me know in the comments who you guys have in the Lamont Roach rematch with Gervonta Davis and Roach. I got Tank, but thank you guys for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Catch you guys on the next one. Peace.